Stefan said, I'm with Sithe Global. At Sithe, we focus on high-impact, transformative power projects, primarily in the developing and emerging markets. The nature of utility-scale geothermal projects give them the potential to have a positive, transformative impact as long as the risks are understood, fully analyzed, and properly managed. Let's see if this works. Okay, good. Geothermal development differs from conventional power development in both good and challenging ways. The environmental profile and its small footprint creates significant opportunities for development. And although geothermal is a mature technology, as we know from the presentations earlier today, the increased focus on renewables worldwide has made it considered a cutting-edge opportunity. High availability factors make geothermal very suitable for baseload development, and because of the need for geothermal in emerging economies, tax and fiscal incentives are available, particularly for first movers in a particular jurisdiction. In addition, as we saw this morning from the World Bank's announcement, renewable programs are being developed across several lines to provide financing, particularly in the troubling early stages when the risks are high. An example of this is EIB has raised funding from climate awareness bonds for different renewable projects and intends to devote a significant amount of those funds to early stage geothermal. In addition, the module design for geothermal allows for development in resources and stages. The initial approach for geothermal should first consider the basics for solid project development before we get to the more unique risks in a geothermal project. For a solid power project, it should meet the following criteria. There should be a credit-worthy off-taker, which is usually the first step to securing a development. There should be solid economics as evidenced by a well-put-together financial model that has been stressed for various downside sensitivities. There needs to be a solid source of equity capital, and this is particularly important for the development and the cost during the exploration phase. Exploration phase. There should be full social and environmental studies performed. There should be political risk coverage, or at least knowledge that it's going to be available at closing. In order to support the credit-worthy off-taker, generally a company like Sithe would seek a sovereign guarantee on the power contract to provide additional confidence in that the project will be executed and operational in a feasible way. There should be a strong set of project documents, and in particular, there should be a strong power purchase agreement and an implementation agreement, which usually contains the incentives that we negotiate with the government. In addition, land use issues, transmission issues need to be fully addressed. Any resettlements that are necessary need to be considered. Now, these are all criteria that apply for any power project. They're not unique to geothermal. Geothermal adds an additional set of risks and considerations. As we've been talking about a great deal this morning, there's large upfront development costs for initial phase, including for exploratory drilling. What we're also finding is there's no established one-size-fits-all project financing structure in place for geothermal. The individual nature of these projects lead to individual approaches by lenders. The lending market, because of that, is still developing, particularly for greenfield development. And in some cases, this could lead to the lowest common denominator in the lending group governing the terms and conditions of the loan. It also increases funding costs in the pre-production stages. There's also, going through the unique risks, there's a risk of change in steam characteristics even once production drilling commences. As our technical advisors will tell us, this can be managed by a comprehensive drilling program, including adequate reinjection wells and to maintain the reserve, as well as a plan for makeup wells to maintain the level of resource necessary to support the generation. Because of the nature of these risks in geothermal, there's a need to build in options in both the offtake agreement, which should be signed before you devote the exploratory drilling funds, and the EPC contract. One of the issues, though, options in the EPC contract will affect the firm pricing, and usually are a bit more costly than if you had a firm price up ahead. This also affects the amount of contingency that should be assumed in capital costs and drilling cost projections. And the 800-pound gorilla. And he looks a little heavier than 800 pounds on that big screen, but the major risk that we need to be concerned about in geothermal is the resource risk. Now, the best way to manage resource risk is to fully analyze the resource through careful ground studies, soundings, and resistivity studies even prior to exploratory drilling. It's important to spend extra money on the technical side before you start exploratory drilling to understand everything you can understand from your resource before going underground. It's extremely important to educate all participants in the project, including lenders. It's very important as well to properly size the facility for the resource. A significant number of issues have come up where the facility was sized to take the maximum load out of the resource and unfortunately depleted resources early in their stages. The exploratory phases and productivity drilling have to be executed properly from a technical perspective. Those are the steps you can take to try to manage the resource risk and to give you the best chance for success. Now this slide, it shows the stages of financing of a geothermal project. As indicated, the early stages for the preliminary work and exploratory drilling are the riskiest phases. We would hope, and in an ideal situation, once we get through with exploratory drilling, the project should be considered to have reached a point of bankability. And by bankability, as a developer, I approach these projects with an eye toward a non-recourse project finance being put in place. The expectation is once you get through exploratory drilling, conduct your well testing and show successful results, that you could then draw down on non-recourse project financing. And as we said before, the highest risk capital is usually during the preliminary work and the exploratory drilling phase. Now, during the high risk phase, there are a number of sources of capital that should be considered when the project is the riskiest. The obvious one is, that gets factored in, is sponsor equity. Usually sponsor equity comes in both at the high risk stages and once we reach conventional financing. But in addition to equity capital, there are grant and similar alternative funding programs that are opening up for geothermal. Currently in place is for instance, in East Africa is the Geothermal Risk Mitigation Fund that's administered by KfW. And they have just concluded their first round of pre-qualification for the initial set of grants, and $50 million has been set aside to fund those grants. If the timeline holds true, they expect to rank their grants according to the shortlisted participants in August of this year. But that is only the first round of those grants, and KfW and the GRMF expect to issue subsequent rounds. Again, this is for East Africa development along the Rift Valley. There are other programs. The World Bank group has ongoing programs, as was announced this morning. They have a global environmental facility, and as well as IFC has a geo fund The GeoFund, incidentally, is being issued in connection with insurance programs, I believe by Munich Re in Turkey. The World Bank program, and again, and in addition to that, the Nordic Development Fund for Renewable Energy Projects, which is being offered in connection with the Icelandic government, are primarily focused on direct government assistance. In structuring an overall power project, though, developers should be able to tap into the benefits of that assistance by working with those governments. UNDP has a framework for geothermal development under the term Sustainable Energy for All, and they're working with a number of countries directly to try to put the benefits of that program in place. EIB, as I mentioned, has funds available through their climate awareness bonds. A number of these programs are in their initial phases, so aside from the GRMF, which is active now, a number of the procedures for tapping into these funds are still being set up, but they should be operational in the next year or two. There's also debt funding that's been issued in some cases, even during the exploratory drilling stage. However, those facilities are usually available for balance sheet financing structures. As Stefan indicated from Munich Re, there's insurance products and the geothermal well productivity insurance, which at least is a backup on exploration drilling and it may be used in production drilling, as he answered the question. Various DFIs and lenders have indicated interest in providing equity during the exploratory drilling phase. A couple that stand out are FMO and IFC through their InfraVentures division. And during the exploratory drilling phase, government participation, as we've seen in Kenya by GDC, where the governments actually take the full drilling risk, government participation is available to help with that risk as well. Now, once the exploratory drilling is complete, and at least for a developer, we'd be hopeful that and expect that then we could go to a straight project finance structure. There is financing out there. With regard to the DFIs, because of the environmental characteristics of geothermal, the DFIs have all individually stated and shown that they're very interested in participating in funding for geothermal. A number of the institutions that Sithe has worked with are listed directly, and as I said, from direct discussion with them, I know they are very eager to participate in a good quality geothermal project. In addition, funding is available from XM lenders, and it depends on the makeup of your consortium, as well as your equipment manufacturer and EPC contractor and drilling companies. Generally, a lot of the equipment comes from Japan, so JBIC financing should be available. And this financing could either be sourced directly or sourced as a backup guarantee on additional funds out of the DFIs. There's also commercial bank financing, and again, the expectation would be that that would be on typical non-recourse project financing structures. Now, normally once you're ready to give notice to proceed on construction after you've completed your exploratory drilling, you've secured your firm offtake agreement, you have your equity committed, you'd expect to be able to draw down on your senior debt once you to commence production drilling. I think what we find is because the lenders are currently looking at the geothermal model, it's not exactly clear how that first draw would be structured. It's not exactly clear what kind of CPs would be required. As I said, it's important to note that lender views vary and are in part dependent on both the stage of the project, whether it's not an expansion project or a greenfield project. That's very relevant, as well as the lender's prior experience in prior geothermal financings. We find that there have been some very large projects which have run into technical drilling issues along the way, required additional equity contributed. And we find that to the extent the lenders have seen that, they want to conduct very much more detailed due diligence on what your drilling program is going to be. It's going to be important to engage in a very a significant educational campaign with those lenders to make sure they understand your technical approach. In some cases, funding may only be available in stages. Obviously it's not an ideal case, and some lenders may require some proof of the production wells before loan draws are allowed. The lenders consider each project to go through a learning curve. As you drill more production wells, they get more confident in the resource. In some cases, it may be required to fund some of the early production drilling with more equity and possibly a more expensive sub-debt tranche. And usually when a sub-debt tranche is negotiated, the lenders will want that sub-debt tranche to be outstanding for a specific tenor, so that'll increase the cost of the financing. In very rare cases, in some extreme cases, some lenders may require a majority or all production wells to be drilled before senior debt is released. We believe this is not going to be the case. We believe that to the extent you can prove your resource and educate the lenders, that a more typical project financing approach would take place. In prior cases, this has led to senior debt essentially being a refinancing of sponsor equity rather than a construction facility. But again, a position like that will dampen a lot of the participation for these projects. As I said, every resource has separate and distinct characteristics. Similarly, lenders have different views as to how much of a production stream needs to be certified. I've covered some of this in the prior slide, but the one additional point I want to make is that to the extent the resource itself is based on initial studies substantially larger than the scale of the project supporting the funding, it may be possible to arrange drawdowns at a much lower threshold. And again, it's a matter of educating the lending group and supporting the conclusions on the strength of the resource with documented technical drilling support, engineering support well in advance of finalizing funding conditions. Okay, so what conclusions can we draw from this? Every geothermal project and resource is individual in terms of quality and risk. The priority should be to put together a solid project on all fronts. Again, this is basic tenets of development. You have to cover all your risks and cover them well. And also to fully analyze the resource by thorough ground studies prior to exploratory drilling. A detailed financial model needs to be developed, and full sources of funds, including contingencies on all downside cases, need to be identified and structured prior to exploratory drilling. You want to know once you start going into the ground that you're not going to have to suspend schedule, create problems with your lenders because you don't have the equity and other capital set aside. Facilities for early high-risk capital should be researched and secured in time to comply with necessary timelines to complete exploratory drilling and full well testing. The funding resources for exploratory drilling on my slide it's a very limited list. There are many sources of funds being put together right now for geothermal. As I said, it's viewed by the market as being a cutting-edge technology, even though it's a mature technology. So you have to look at the project in your region. You have to look at what the latest programs are to really see what's out there. Senior debt lenders should be consulted with early and provide an opportunity to fully analyze risks. As I said, project financing for utility scale, very large projects, is still in developing stages. And it helps to have your voice as part of that discussion to make sure that a practical solution is put in place by your lending group. As part of that discussion, draw conditions as well as potential draw stops or tenor extensions should be considered. And that'll help to engineer the final structure and conditions, which in turn will help you have a credible financial model. Lastly, all project documents, the power purchase agreement, the implementation agreement, engineer procurement and construction contract, and common terms agreement with lenders need to be drafted to allow flexibility based on the ultimate quality and quantity of steam once the production drilling is complete. You want to make sure your entire project holds together, and you want to get those documents negotiated to the extent you can before exploratory drilling, and then finalized in time for your production drilling. That's the discussion. I thank you for your time and appreciate any questions that you might have.